Today I want to continue the discussion about how our self is structured. But before I begin, I wanted to say a few words about something I consider very important. Look, I'm talking about how the self is structured, but at the same time, no one really knows for sure. Indeed, how exactly the brain produces consciousness remains unknown. How our self is actually structured is a major mystery for science, and no one fully knows how it works. So, what I'm doing here is not aimed at telling you what is really happening in reality. Simply put, no one knows this. What I am currently attempting to do here is trying to demonstrate a very specific and unique perspective on the various things that are constantly occurring all around us. And these things happen to us. They may not be entirely accurate in every detail, but they will certainly give you a much clearer picture of what is truly going on. And having this picture will help you to successfully accomplish your personal goals in a much more effective manner and become a more effective and successful person in life. We, and this is known for certain, we as living organisms, and not just humans, have this very mechanism that leads us from our actual state to our desired state. And when we move from the actual state to the desired one, there is a certain stage where we make a decision about how to act. And we make our decision about how to act based on our previous experience and our understanding of the world. In our head, in our consciousness, this is really what happens. We have a certain picture of the world. So this picture of the world does not necessarily have to be completely accurate or correspond to reality, because, as I already mentioned, in the end, no one really knows how this reality is structured. Nevertheless, this picture of the world can be good enough for us to successfully achieve our goals and successfully reach these desired situations and to choose the right strategy of behavior well. Now I will, so to speak, move on to the specific things I want to talk about. Today, I want to talk about dimensions, so to speak. I will call them the dimensions of ourselves. It is essentially like the different layers and planes in which our sense of self exists, and how the gaps between these planes can often create undesirable effects. And how, by being aware of these planes, one can deal with these undesirable emotional situations. All right, that's enough of these abstract things. I'm going to start talking about what, in fact, I want to discuss. Our self has 6 planes in which it exists. To understand these 6, you need to understand the first 3. And there is a factor that, as it were, makes a copy from these 3 main ones, creates a copy and adds 3 more. Our first self is the actual self. This is the self that at this very moment is what we think about ourselves. Mainly, this is based on our memories. There is also such a thing as the self-schema. This is how our understanding of ourselves, our goals, and our experiences, our autobiographical memory, affects the way we perceive the world around us. But the most important thing I want to explain now is that there is a certain actual self that acts at this very moment. The second plane, or the second world in which our self lives, is the ideal self. This is the self of our aspirations, the self of our desires. For example, let me give you an example. When I say I, you need to understand that I always mean a specific hierarchy of goals. I think I've already talked about the hierarchy of goals and how it creates the self in one of the previous videos. I'll explain it again. For example, I'll take the self, the representation of my professional life. Here I am as a professional, I work as a programmer. Within the framework of I am a programmer, there is a hierarchy of goals. I have a major goal that, for example, led me to this profession, like the desire to pay for an apartment to earn money. Within this hierarchy of I am a programmer, I have major long-term goals, like completing a project. And at every level, each of these major goals creates a kind of hierarchy, a chain of secondary goals, like answering a phone call, scheduling a meeting, or solving a problem. Getting up and arriving at the office on time, taking the correct turn on the way to the office, dressing appropriately. What I am describing is exactly what I call a hierarchy of tasks. A large chain of tasks and subtasks that support each other. And each of our self-representations has its own, this hierarchy of goals. In fact, it is the hierarchy of goals that actually creates the self. I can have my own hierarchy of goals within. For example, the videos I record, say I am a psychologist or a teacher, my hierarchy of goals within my family life, each one. This hierarchy of goals, in a way, creates a new copy of the self. So let me return to what I was talking about earlier. We have the actual self. This is my understanding of my current goals, what I am generally engaged in within this representation of myself. There is the self as a programmer, and there is the ideal self. These are my ideas about what I strive for, who I want to become. These are my personal aspirations specifically. There may be situations where my ideal self and my actual self are far apart from each other. Research shows that depressive states and moods are often associated with, a large gap between the actual self and the ideal self, which leads to depressive conditions. It can also happen that the actual self and the ideal self are close to each other. And this is actually what is associated with the feeling of happiness. And now I'll jump ahead a little. I'll be talking about the different worlds in which the self lives. Every time we get closer, when my actual self gets closer to myself, to this other self, we will be getting closer to happiness. Every time it moves away, we will see that this causes emotional tension of one kind or another. All right? I've covered the actual self and the ideal self. Now there's another self, which in Russian is called the odd self. It's probably worth mentioning it. And this is the self that our idea of duty, of what? There's no other way to talk about duty. And this ought self can come into play. It's not always ideal. It can come into conflict. And to make it clearer, I'll give an example. For example, in terms of professional life, let's say a programmer. I'm from Russia. And in Russia, I think, as in many other places, this idea of what one ought to do often comes to us. Its source is the culture in which we grew up. And for example, with I'm a programmer, there can be a lot of things associated with it that a programmer is supposed to know or be able to do. For instance, there are a lot of jokes that a programmer can't fix a printer, and people say that because a programmer is supposed to be able to do that. But a programmer doesn't necessarily have to know how to fix a printer. Or often, for example, you can find a lot of examples in gender differences, because our cultures often impose various things on us that a certain gender, female or male, is supposed to do. A woman must be, a housewife, and a man must be the breadwinner. Even though a woman's personal goals might be to become a scientist and a man's, on the contrary, there might be a man who actually wants to spend most of his time at home with his family. His personal, his actual, and his ideal self will be in conflict with the I must. And this is where problems will arise. He will feel, again, studies show that this leads to anxiety states. When there is a gap between the actual self and the should self, this leads to anxiety states. All right. I'll repeat again what we've covered. We have the actual self, the ideal self, and the should self. Now we know these three. This is the foundation. What I'm talking about may not be immediately clear in many ways. And when I read about this myself, it took me some time to figure it out. And it was very helpful. I made a sort of table for myself and took each of my self-representations. For example, I am a programmer. I tried to find the image of the ideal programmer, the one that matters to me, the one I aspire to become. Then, the image of what ought to be within the framework of this self-representation. All right. We can continue now. Where does another copy come from? As I already mentioned, we have three main ones here. And now I'll talk about three more, how these copies appear and where they come from. in order to understand where they come from. The other three dimensions in which our self exists, I need to explain what authority is. There is an intuitive understanding of what authority means, and it will really help us here. In Russian literature, what I'm talking about is also referred to as the significant other. In English literature, this is called the significant other. We're talking about the fact that in our lives, in each of these self-representations during their development, there were people who influenced us. For example, for a child, his older relatives, for instance, his brother or older parents, are people who are important to him. When we are learning something, for example, how to drive a car, our instructor is important to us. We observe how he does it. And the clearest example of who these important others, these significant others are, is precisely in education, in learning. When we are learning, we choose a certain person, and for us, they sort of become an ideal model and they influence us. And these people become sources of copies. We have a copy of the actual self, and we have what we think, how we believe we are seen by the people who are important to us. We know that the people who are important to us have an idea of what we should do. They have an idea of what we ought to be, the ought self. And they have an idea of, and we are aware of this, what we should strive for. They have an idea of what we should be, the ideal self. And these influential figures and significant others actually extend their influence remarkably far into our lives. And they are consistently encountered and recognized, not only in the realms of formal learning or academic education, for example. Influencers are people who are significant others for a large number of people. Politicians, for example, leaders or dictators, their main, so to speak, well, it's their bread and butter to be significant others for as many people as possible. And there are actually many examples, starting from such simple ones. Family examples where for a child their mother or father is a significant other, or for a student their teacher is a significant other, all the way up to the examples I just mentioned. So because they create a copy of these self-representations, ideal self, actual self, ought self, other possibilities for discrepancy arise. For example, I might have an idea of what I should do within the framework of this self, and I have a significant other. And I know that, for example, they believe that what I ought to do is something completely different. Again, we can return to those clear illustrative examples that many have heard and seen, when, for instance, a man might believe that his goal, as a student, for example, is to become an artist. He is acutely aware of the fact that the society in which he lives constantly imposes upon him the rigid idea that he should, for example, become a successful businessman, while at the same time a deeply important person in his life, say for instance his own father, firmly believes that he should instead be a dedicated soldier. And there is this big gap which will lead to significant psychological and emotional tension. In this example, my goal just now, by talking about this, was to illustrate and provide enough examples so that you could understand the whole picture. Let me quickly go over what I've talked about once more, because I understand that, in general, well, it creates a model that isn't exactly simple, so it's worth going over it once more. We have the actual self, which is held in our memories and in our perception of ourselves. We have the ideal self, which is what we strive for, what we personally aspire to. We have the ought self, which is our idea of what we should do. And in each of these self-representations, there is always at least one authority figure or important person. By the way, it's also very interesting when this happens. And this also creates tension in the psyche, for example, when we have a self-representation. Say, I am a programmer. And I have a teacher, the one from my university who taught me. And for example, at work, I have a senior colleague who is also important to me. And at some point, I start to realize that they contradict each other. And this also causes or can cause tension because now I don't know. I have two authority figures and I don't know. They contradict each other. You see, this also leads to problems. That's it. We have the actual self, we have the ideal self, the ought self, we have important people who may come and go, but they create a copy. We have important people, and we care about what they think of us. We care. We are interested in what their idea of the ought is, and what their idea of the ideal is. Often, of course, we don't ask them about this directly, but this is the main source of emotional tension. Our emotions are very closely connected to this. Again, I'll return to the beginning, back to the hierarchy of goals. We are organisms that our behavior is built around achieving goals. Our emotions are a mechanism that evolved over the course of evolution. In order to help us, it's better for us to achieve our goals. Our emotions are what signal to us whether we have achieved a goal or not. Emotions allow us to set priorities within the hierarchy of tasks, to understand what is important and what is less important. And that's why I am very connected to goals, and emotions are very much connected to goals. We have these important others because they are the people who help us achieve our goals. All right, I'm finished. That's it. This is the model, as I have described it to you. This is its foundation. And I would strongly recommend that you take a few of your professional, family, or even your common everyday situations. From your everyday life, take your various self-representations and carefully go through them one by one. Fill out this detailed table and try to truly understand what your specific idea of the ideal is, what your personal idea of the obligatory is, who exactly is important to you within this self-representation and what their particular view is. And then consider whether there is a significant gap between these different worlds, so to speak, or between these various planes of existence. And on the other hand, you can also look at it this way. If at some point you find yourself feeling anxious, or on the contrary, experiencing more depressive shades of emotion, and you don't really understand why or where it's coming from, most likely it's worth looking for the cause in one of these self-representations of yours. There is that gap I mentioned earlier. I read about this whole story somewhere. It was probably about a month ago, and I'm still exploring myself from this perspective. It's very interesting and really helpful because it truly helps to better understand where certain emotions come from. When we live in a complicated world, we have a lot of self-representations, we have a lot of them. There are all these significant others who influence us. It's very easy to get confused by all of this. That's why it's sometimes very helpful to reduce all of this to a really simple mechanism and understand where everything comes from. That's all. That's it for today. Good luck and take care of your well-being.